Hi everyone. Welcome to the third project in the Materials, Space, and Meaning class. This is the Visual Transformation Project. What I'm going to do in this short video is to give you the project description, talk about some potential strategies, and then to, at the end, offer some slightly concrete suggestions to get you started on this one. As I have talked about in the class over the past couple projects, the arc of the class goes from being more restrictive to being less restrictive. This one kind of right in the middle, where you have some guidelines and some things that I'm asking you to do specifically, but you also have a lot of freedom. And so I think some of you are probably going to enjoy that quite a lot. So you might want to take a moment and just pull up that project description that you'll be able to find on Moodle. It's a relatively short project description compared to some of the others. And this one, there's less of a demonstration, so I don't necessarily have to go through how to work with wood or how to work with cardboard. But I do want to, like I said earlier, give you some examples and some ideas about that. So hopefully you've been able to find that project description, and we're just going to take a look at that now. So the purpose of the project is to consider the relationship between color, pattern, image, and solid form, or volumetric form as we called it in your last project, and how we can transform those or sort of alter your previous projects. As I've said before, I tend to write my project descriptions quite carefully to be short and succinct and outline what it is that I would like you to do. So the project description is probably the most important thing here, and I'll read that for you now. Transform your theme and variation project by strategically altering it with two-dimensional media. Make it more visually compelling and energizing. So basically, make it a better piece. And when I talk about strategically altering it, that's kind of an important phrase that's there. I think generally most of the other ones, the rest of the description is pretty straightforward. What I want you to do is to work with your previous project. So don't alter it. When I say I want you to strategically alter it with two-dimensional media, what that means is that I don't want you to physically destroy it. I want you to add things to it, but when you hand it in again for this assignment, I want it to I want it to look exactly the same shape, the same characteristics, the same structure, but you are going to be adding things onto the surface to transform it. And so that's the difference in this assignment. So I want you to add things by paint, collage, like whatever, we'll talk about that, all the different media that you can think of. I want you to do that in a way that will make it more visually compelling and energizing. I want you to make it a better object, a better visual experience. So let's talk about some ideas related to that and circle back then at the end about some strategies. So when we talk about visual destruction or alteration versus sort of actual destruction and alteration. Again, what that really means is that I don't want you to actually destroy this, and I don't want you to like stand on it or like cut it up or anything like that. The visual destruction means that the surface of what you have made, you're applying things only to the surface. You're not sort of physically manipulating the object that you have made already, other than adding things to the surface. And that's a pretty clear guideline. That's I would say of the restrictions in this assignment, that's the deal breaker. You can't change that. You can only change the visual characteristics. And also, I thought that it would be worth kind of talking about, because sometimes when I give this assignment, I look out and I see people with mischievous grins on their faces who have the idea that visual destruction or visual alteration is actually a pretty easy exercise, and just get a can of spray paint and sort of graffiti the thing like you might sort of tag an old abandoned building or something. That would certainly do it. And so we do need to think a little bit about how we're going to approach this, or how you folks are going to approach this. And I have just sort of thought about this as simple destruction versus thoughtful alteration. Obviously, with simple destruction, things like this. And this is actually, fresh off the news in the last few months with a lot of the vandalism that's been happening with different monuments, and even sort of destruction and like removal, unwanted or unsanctioned, you could say, removal of some of these monuments. And I want to be clear that as I'm sort of tossing this up here, I'm not sort of advocating this, or I'm not holding this up as I'm not pro or against this action in the course of this conversation. What I'm saying is that what we're looking at right here, splashing paint on a monument, is a really low level of kind of destruction. Low level, and it's not very thoughtful. It certainly gets the job done, doesn't take very long, but it's not very revealing. And I would say, just as an academic, if we sort of stand back from this and remove it from the social context for a moment, I would say, is this more visually compelling or engaging than it was before? I don't know. It sends a different message, but I really don't think it's sort of that. It doesn't maybe have the fun. Well, not that they were trying to be fun, but it doesn't necessarily have any sort of content or conceptual component to it other than to destroy it. So it's a relatively low level, a simple order of visual destruction. Also, something like this, I don't know if you folks remember, probably when you were super young or perhaps not even born yet, the United States had invaded Iraq to depose Saddam Hussein, who was the dictator there at the time. After he was deposed in 2003, then he, like a lot of dictators, he had, tons of memorials and paintings and statues of himself sort of all over the place. And these were then rife for, people going through, certainly at the conquering nations that came in, was basically the U.S., we sort of altered a lot of those. And we'll see another example of this as we sort of go through a bit more of the slides. But again, this is not making a political statement. This is just sort of observing how you can change the meaning of things. Like by altering the surface, how can you change the meaning? And this, again, is a really low level of destruction. I'm not even really destroying it so much, but just like, charring it is a pretty low order of destruction. You see this kind of thing all the time in the transition of empires, where the previous empires, the symbols of the previous empires, are destroyed in these really low level activities. And so that's really not what we're talking about with this. It would be, to take your project and a can of spray paint, a little bit of paint, like whatever, in really just a few moments, you can visually destroy it. But again, it's like, does that make it more visually compelling? Does that make it more visually engaging? I don't think so. So simple destruction is extremely easy, and that's not where we're headed. What we are thinking about then is how to make these things more interesting, more compelling, more engaging. Have contradictions, have some humor, have some perhaps other characteristics that will sort of make them just generally be a better object when you're done. And so when we think about visual alterations, there are really a couple of different strategies that you can go toward, and these are going to be the examples that we're going to look at today. A lot of the alterations that will be employed by students are alterations that destroy an object's visual identity and characteristics. That is, the way that it looks on the outside. The line, shape, value, texture, color, those kinds of things. And in sort of approaching that, there's methods that you can use to visually erase, create discord, or to just generally change the form. And these start to be used if you're strategic and kind of thoughtful and experiment a little bit. You can find some really terrific tensions between what you have already created with your object. Your objects, the theme and variation projects have identities. You went out in the woods, you found these things, and generated these motifs and sort of created this structure. These have identity. There are visual themes that are there. And now what we're going to be doing is sort of working against that, or changing that, or altering that. Altering those visual characteristics. So that's one approach, is to alter the visual characteristics. Another really is to destroy an object's meaning, by creating conceptual confusion, discord, or minimalization, excuse me. The meaning. And so there are a couple of different strategies. You can either attack, what the object looks like, or you can attack sort of the meanings that are associated with that object. And one of the things that I blew past really quickly at the beginning of this was the fact that I'm asking you to, in effect, kind of destroy to some degree. I would maybe use the word transform. The name of the project is a visual transformation project. But it is something where you are going to be destroying what you have already made in order to go in a different direction. And that is like, well, why, Ken? I spent all this time working on this project. Why are you asking me to do this? It doesn't seem to make any sense. It took me so long to get something meaningful and interesting. And some of you are probably at that spot. I don't want to. I cared about this thing. And this is maybe a big idea in art that ideas sort of are constantly being transformed. There's a pretty famous story about a guy who used to teach drawing, like an upper level graduate drawing class. And on the last day of the critique, he had asked everybody to bring their best drawing. And so, and everybody assumed that they were going to have a critique, right? And so they all brought these drawings, and he just handed out erasers, and he went around and he told everybody, said, you have to erase your best drawing in order to pass the class. And of course, everybody sort of weeped and moaned and gnashed their teeth, but eventually they all wanted to pass, so they erased the drawing. And of course, his explanation for this was not to be cruel. It wasn't just an arbitrary thing. The goal for him was to demonstrate to them that, I think when we have successes in art, because success can be challenging to find at times. Sometimes we believe that, it was dumb luck, or I'll never be able to reproduce it. And he wanted to take that away. It was a way actually for him to take away that doubt by the students, by him telling them, you can do this again. You've gotten this good. This specific drawing is not the end of you. Is not the end of your ability. So that's part of it. And the other part of it too is that ideas in art are constantly being recycled. This is a very important idea, for artists, is that we're constantly reinventing, transforming, changing, altering things that we have done. And if you let things get too precious, it can really stand in the way of your development as an artist. And frankly, I think a lot of these things that I'm talking about resonate out into a person's life and resonate out into our spirituality as well. But anyhow, let's maybe take a look at we're going to start with some of these alterations that destroy an object's visual identity and characteristics, forms of visual change. And then towards the end, we'll look at a few alterations that are more about creating some conceptual changes. One of the biggest and most intriguing kinds of ideas related to visual change and alteration has to do with camouflage. And I love talking about some of these because there's so many great examples, and I have a bunch of great examples here we're going to chat about. This example right here is a man who, I believe this is from the Vietnam era. And you can see that he's wearing the full camo. If he was not sort of, showing his teeth right there, there'd be very little that would distinguish him from, the surrounding jungle around him. And this is an example, of course, of visual erasure, because what this guy wants to do is to hide. And so he has painted himself. He has painted, to match his clothing, which also kind of matches the surrounding, jungle that he would be in. And so camouflage is tremendous examples of that. In terms of like visual alteration, visual erasure, this is a really great way to kind of play around with the idea. And so in this one, what you're finding is that he is trying to escape visual detection. And if you do just a quick Google search from Vietnam up through, as we started getting involved in some of the Middle East conflicts, of course, then all of a lot of the camouflage, was altered at that point, and it started to get into these sand textures and whatnot. And so this camouflage is a constant source of, you could say, there's almost like an arms race in camouflage in terms of where we're going and the things that sort of get erased and the things that we're trying to hide and ways that we're trying to hide those things, which are really fascinating. And they're all about sort of visual alteration. You're trying to hide things, you're trying to alter them, you're trying to make people see things that aren't there, you're trying to erase things that are there. More recently in these camouflage patterns, you're starting to see this kind of pixelation. And so this is actually a pattern of camouflage fabric that you can buy online right now. It's not secret or anything, you can just get this, but one of the things that has occurred, I'm going to go back one slide here. One of the things that has occurred, if you go out and you look at the top row, the second from the right, the kind of green and black and red one, right, sample on the top there, you can see that would be a pattern that would be really great if you're trying to avoid detection in certain circumstances by people seeing you. But what's happening now in certain types of military situations is it's not actual eyes that are being, sort of looking for people. It's computer-aided digital processes that are looking for individuals. And so what they've done is they've created these pixelizations on the fabric and so when the digital cameras sort of see these, they reduce it to pixelized information. And of course, this actually becomes more hidden compared to the previous sample that I was just telling you, because there were more fluid lines that would show up stronger in those kind of digital situations. So camouflage is a really big deal, and even some of the protests that we are seeing, or people that occasionally try to hide some of the facial recognition, or hide from, or evade, or stymie, or just generally mess with the facial recognition software. And protests, you occasionally will see things like this. I don't know how successful these are. I know that these are people that are trying to do that. I think they actually are kind of successful. But what these folks are up to are they realize that the facial recognition software, what it does is it measures the relationships between your eyes, distance between your eyes, eyebrows, nostrils, nose, mouth, these sort of are the architecture of the face, more or less, and it measures those things really carefully. And so what it tries to do, what these folks are trying to do in the software like this, or excuse me, in the painting like this, is to stymie that software to create visual confusion. And I gotta tell you, I think that's a pretty engaging idea. As an artist, I'm sort of drawn to that, like painting in order to hide, or painting in order to, conceal or confuse. I think that's a compelling idea. The one on the bottom is actually a bit of a speculative thing that a jeweler made at one point. I'm not really sure which designer it was, but I remember seeing that, where those are reflective discs, which again will sort of stymie the reflective, interpretive software that is used for facial recognition. So we're seeing things like this as a means to visually alter and visually change, evade detection, change the nature. You can look at, even just sort of looking at these people's faces and the way that they have now been altered as a way to camouflage is really quite curious. I think that they're starting to be pretty compelling and interesting already. So there may be some carry away for you on that note. Let's take a minute now and think a little bit about another camouflage situation, real life camouflage situation, and I want to do a little thought experiment with you. Let's pretend for a minute that you folks are artists. You're back in England in, say, the late 1930s, and a dilemma that has popped up, serious dilemma, is that the recently invented submarines have been circling the nation, and they have been like blowing up all the ships that are bringing supplies in for the Second World War. So it'd be like early 1940s. So a bunch of artists are sitting around, the military is there, and the military gives this problem. And this is what the artists are asked. It's like, we want you to figure out how to paint a ship so that a submarine looking through a periscope can't hit it. We want you to figure out some way to paint the ship so that it's difficult for the submarine to hit it. Real life situation actually happened, and there's some pretty interesting solutions that emerge from that. First of all, there's a realization that it's simply not possible to paint a battleship so that it disappears. And so like the disappearing problem is not really going to work. That's not really possible. And so as these artists were sitting around, one of the sources of information they looked at was actually this. And this is very curious, because when you think about critters like zebras on the African savanna, they use camouflage in a very different way than a lot of other animals use camouflage. Normally in the natural world, the camouflage is used to resemble the surroundings, so the creature hides, or the plant hides, or the insect hides. That's not what is happening with zebras. The way that the camouflage works with zebras is that as they are being chased and as they are being pursued on the savanna by lions and hyenas and other predators, the camouflaging confuses them, because as the zebras are traveling in packs, it's difficult for the predators chasing them to discern between one zebra and the next and the next. And you can see, actually, it's a really great example in this picture right here, where if you look in the center, it's even with the advantage of still photography, it's difficult to actually count how many zebras are there. It's like, is it 2? Is it 3? Is it 4 in the middle? It's like, it's actually pretty hard to tell. So the goal is not to disappear, which was the goal of the first instance of camouflage, or that soldier trying to hide and completely disappear in the jungle. In this situation, the goal is to confuse and to stymie and to create visual disruption. Like there are other advantages to this too, even for excuse me, a single ship traveling. And by the way, one of the reasons that this worked is because often these ships travel in convoys. And so as you know, get a half a dozen to a dozen ships traveling these convoys, a submarine pokes up the periscope, they take a look, difficult to see where one ship starts, the next one ends. And even as you can see for a ship traveling alone like this, it's difficult to discern, well, is this ship like, is it squared up against me at 90 degrees? Is it slightly tipped with the front or the bow? You know, is that pointing a little bit closer to me or not? What kind of a ship actually is it? And again, we have the advantage of you know, having a long time to look at the picture. A periscope, they would just be popping that up for a moment or two, and they would have to try to figure it out. So you can see in the center of the ship, there's a tremendous amount of visual disruption. And so this kind of painting, which is called a razzle-dazzle pattern, the official name for that is the razzle-dazzle pattern. This kind of painting disrupts the information that you can get from it. It's hard to see what direction, it's harder, not hard, it's harder to see what direction the ship is going. It's harder to see, you know, where one ship starts, where the next one ends. And it's a pattern that's implemented in a lot of different ways. In a lot of different situations. Even a situation like this, it's hard to discern where the ship is, you know, relative to the surroundings behind it and whatnot. Here's a really great example. There's actually some structure and some landscape behind this. And so you see that the goal was to mystify and to stymie and to create visual disruption, as opposed to just trying to paint something out and paint, you know, disappeared. Because it matters a lot. If you're aiming a torpedo at a battleship, matters a lot where that thing goes. And so if they can throw you off just a little bit, that can make a big difference. So there's another type of camouflage, other instances of military camouflage. I don't know that this is necessarily scalable to or applicable to the you know, the assignment that you folks are working on, but there's some really great stories. I just love telling these stories. This was the Ghost Army, was actually a sort of quote unquote army, not really an army. It was actually just a group of people that were assigned with creating the illusion of troops where troops actually did not exist. And so there were several instances in cases, you know, one was during the Battle of the Bulge, for example, where there was a place where there weren't very many Allied troops, and they wanted the Germans to think that there were a lot of Allied troops there. And so they called in this ghost army, which again was just a relatively small group of guys. And what they did was that they had sound recordings that they had made of a real like battalion, you know, the noises that a battalion makes, which are big and small noises, and people talking and trucks and things being constructed and all of this. And so they would actually come in with these huge speakers, and they would point those speakers, you know, obviously hidden, but they would point these speakers towards the enemy, and then they would play this sort of white noise that a battalion would make. And the Germans on the other side then would think that there was indeed a battalion there. And this just worked over and over and over again, these soundscapes that they would create, the illusion of troops, which were I think they're very funny. I tried to find some recordings of it, but I was not able to. This one that you're looking at right here, the other way that the Ghost Army worked was to actually create objects. And so if you remember the movie Saving Private Ryan about the invasion of Normandy on D-Day, one of the big backstories of that is that the Allied forces were trying to get the Germans to believe that the invasion was going to take place about 100 miles away, 100 miles further north or so. And so what they did was they created all these fake inflatable tanks, plywood airplanes, you know, just like basically just like they amassed this huge fake army way farther north. And they also took their best general, who was General Patton, and they installed him up here to kind of oversee this fake army. And they allowed it to be photographed by, you know, by airplanes flying overhead, and it worked. And so for a long time, like even during D-Day, which was a very difficult invasion, Even it was quite late. It was like days and days after the invasion that the Germans finally realized that it was not going to be happening so far north. That it was indeed that was a what's called a feint or a fake out that happened. And so these inflatable tanks. I just love this image with these four guys in this inflatable tank, which I think is really terrific. So. Another example of kind of camouflage well, I don't know if this is exactly camouflage, but it's certainly camouflage. A deception. There's a certain deception here occurred in the First World War. The First World War was fought largely through trench warfare and artillery shells, and so there would be like one side the Allied forces on one side, or the sort of British forces on one side, the Germans on the other. And because it was mostly an artillery battle, any trees that would have been in the vicinity would just like eventually get kind of blown up down to these nubs, which look sort of like this. And so some very clever artists again realized that there was potential here, and so what they did was they would go out and they would create reproductions of these trees. And sometimes they would cast them in metal, so they actually kind of armored a little bit. Sometimes they were just like plaster and paper and wood, and they would paint them up to look like the real trees. And so under cover of darkness, then they would go out, they would cut down the real tree, they would install the fake tree that people could climb into and climb up and sit up there all day with binoculars and look at the enemy, get a very good look at the enemy through these fake trees. And you can see the guy here, he even had like the looking through that hole in the top, even had the camouflage hands and the covering that he wore that matched this fake tree to get a little bit of a further advantage. So here's another pretty well known, pretty well documented example. I believe I actually wasn't able to find out where this was either, but I'm pretty sure it was out in California. There was a very large Boeing factory that was making, airplanes, and those airplanes would be super sensitive. Obviously, you don't want people to know where those factories are, and they were very, very big. The factories to make these planes were just huge. They took up dozens of football fields big. They were just like really large, and so this particular one, which is a Boeing bomber factory, they hired Hollywood set designers to come out, and they wanted to disguise it. And so they specifically wanted to disguise it from the air. They weren't so much worried about people like driving around taking photographs, because they knew they couldn't hide it from that. But they wanted to be able to hide this by any sort of people flying over the top, any sort of Japanese or German bombers. It probably would have been Japanese if it was on California side, but any bombers flying over, they wanted to hide it. So they built this fake neighborhood with these fake trees and fake cars and fake houses, and eventually ended up looking like this. And so that dark square in the center, that's quite big, that is actually the fake town that they built over the top of the actual factory. And even at this point, from this vantage point, it probably doesn't look very convincing. But were you, again, sort of overhead, looking down, in a situation like that, you really just would have a few moments, like maybe three or 4 seconds at most, to look down and try to find this thing. It was, would be concealable from that. So. The Americans were never bombed. That part of the world was never bombed, so it never really tried out. But that was the plan for this bit of camouflage. So artists to the rescue, I guess. There are other kind of notable examples, more recent examples. I tried to find examples of this online as well, but I was not able to. But even during the previous Gulf War that I was talking about with Saddam Hussein, as the Americans were in their airplanes and they were bombing the Iraqi runways, because the first thing you want to do is to try to take out air power. So they would come down and they would bomb the runways. I remember at the time hearing reports about how the Iraqis would go out and they would paint bomb patterns on the runways. And so the American bombers would go down, and they would come down and they would really just have like a second or two to see if the runway had survived the previous bombing run. And if it hadn't, they would hit it again. They would come down, they would see this painted fake pattern, and then they would fly away. So this deception happens a lot in the military, a lot of different situations where that occurs. Which brings us back again to this war. And as I was introing this section I was talking about, there's visual disruption that can occur with visual camouflage, visual disruption, visual change and transformation, and then there's our conceptual ideas that can be applied, or conceptual ideas that can be introduced that can dramatically change the meaning of an object with actually not really changing the physicality or the visuality of the object very much at all. And this is a super iconic image. As soon as this was sort of taken by an American photographer, it was sent all over the world. Again, sort of after Saddam Hussein had been deposed, and they were in the midst of tearing down this sculpture. One of the things that they did is they went up and they put an American flag. They sort of bundled this American flag over the face of Saddam Hussein, the sculpture of Saddam Hussein. And again, this is, perhaps less physically manipulating this, but just this very dramatic gesture of putting one object over another, tremendously, immediately changes its meaning, transforms it. And if you wanted to talk about visual disruption or visual transformation, this would be one instance where just a simple gesture of draping something over it, dramatically change the meaning. Immediately when you saw this, you knew who was in power. Immediately when you saw this, it just spoke volumes about what had just happened in the previous 100 days or so. It was a very iconic and transformative moment. And again, these comments that I'm making about these military affairs, I'm using these as examples because they are potent examples. I'm not sort of talking about specific political positions here. We're really just kind of maybe stepping back as academics and looking at these a little bit more analytically, you could say. Another instance of dramatically changing the meaning. This one is actually a pretty funny one. Example of changing the meaning of a work, quite dramatically, both by changing the visual qualities, but in addition, kind of transforming the meaning of it, through that. Is this monument in Russia. You might actually have seen this because it's become kind of a meme over the years. Back in the day when there was a Soviet bloc before 1990 or so, Bulgaria is one of the Soviet bloc countries, and this was a sculpture, actually larger than life-size sculpture of Russian soldiers that was installed in Bulgaria. And over the last couple years, now that the Soviet bloc no longer exists, we have Russia, but we don't have the Soviet Union. The Soviet bloc no longer exists, and so this is sort of a relic of another time. And so Bulgaria now, which has a different relationship with Russia, artists have been coming in, and this just makes me laugh every time. Artists have been coming in, and they have been painting this, and obviously having great fun with, this very heroic looking, strong, and so heroic looking and very sort of macho and superhero like image, and fooling around a little bit with its meaning. And so they're not just sort of transforming this visually, they're dramatically changing the understanding of this. They're dramatically changing like the actual meaning of the sculpture itself at this point. It's become completely this other identity, completely transformed. So we'll press on. And the last example I have is, since we started with, an example of sort of a contemporary example of sort of, trying to alter the meaning of these, Civil War monuments, as some of the folks have been starting to do. This is maybe another example. The first one that we saw, which was a pretty simple gesture, just in terms of slapping paint on something, which I said was pretty low level gesture. This one here, a bit of a text, slapped on this dramatically changes the meaning as well. And so, with very little work, frankly, just by putting a text on something, because text is so powerful, putting a text or, vandalizing the piece with text in this way really does kind of dramatically change its meaning. So, and again, not making statements about the political position. I would be happy to have that conversation, which I think is long and complex and really interesting. But this is maybe not the time and the place. I would like it to be a conversation rather than a monologue if we're going to talk about these things. So, but I did want to maybe sort of point out that a lot of these things are kind of being used in social conversations about changing the meaning of these monuments. There's visual disruption and examples like this, which is sort of more conceptual disruption, where they're just literally renaming things. This is a perfect example of renaming something to give it a different identity, rather than our Confederate soldiers. It's now this is racist. It's a pretty direct substitution between those two. All right, so next we want to talk a little bit about some potential methods for you to be transforming your theme and variation projects. So, we have a few materials, a few things down in the studio. You're welcome to use that, but by and large, you need to be collecting these, amassing these things by yourself, and working on your own. So one of the probably the most obvious thing that you can use is paints. We typically have some paints down in the studio back in the shelves. Feel free to grab those. But there are forms of paint that you can use. And you want to be thinking a little bit strategically about this, because with the previous project, you spent a lot of time, working towards creating certain visual themes and contrasts and variations and all of that. And as you start to think about what kind of visual patterns or structures or ideas am I going to put on that, not all things are the same. If you just slap a text on something, that might work for one situation, but it could be that I would say that there are very definitely things that are going to work specifically for yours. And so, you may have a pattern and motif that's highly geometric. And it could be then that if you come in and you need to find something that will disrupt that and transform that, that's also highly geometric. Or it could be that working in another strategy, working in something that's maybe like American flags, or like a pop sensibility, like Coke cans, or like targets, like Jasper Johns used to paint. Like that kind of information could particularly transform the specific visual structure of your object in really great ways. And so some experimentation would be in order. And I tell you, one of the things that works really, really well for testing things out on your project is to project things on them. So you can use a projector that's in the classroom. You can hook up a computer. It's pretty easy, and just start projecting images on that piece. Hold up your artwork and see what does this kind of image do on it? What kind of that kind of pattern do? Pull up some different patterns. Pull up some different ideas. Pull up some different texts, and just see what really creates dynamic tension, or what really transforms it in some really great and complicated ways. And then you can paint that, you can, collage that, you can text that, you can even, I don't know how you're going to continuously project the thing on it, but maybe you have means to use a projector and you're able to do that. So that's absolutely possible to transform the pieces by using all of these means. And again, sometimes what you can do is you can also change the context around it. I said you can't transform the object itself, but maybe you can create some other structure around it, change the things that the situation that the piece occurs within, or change the situation of something that's next to it. So I think that there's a lot of dynamic possibility. There's a lot of potentials, and a little experimentation will take you a long ways in terms of figuring out some good strategies for yourself. Again, the goal is not simply just to destroy. Just to destroy, which we saw in almost all those examples of the destruction of the monuments, is a very, very low order of visual destruction, visual engagement. It's really dumb, and it's not that interesting, okay? So what we want is a dynamic tension, some fun stuff happening between those two. Make it more visually compelling and energized. Kill the thing that you've already made, if I can say it that way. You need to kind of sacrifice the thing that you've already made to get to something better. And I think you're going to have some challenges. I think it's going to be a little nerve-wracking at times to do this, but I'm sure you're going to have a great time. So that's all. Hopefully those were some interesting things to think about, and some fun examples from American history, not necessarily art history, but American history to consider. Okay.